Today we will be talking about the ACT practice test number 1, the English section, passage number 5, which is question 61 through 75. And the passage is entitled James Forten, Revolutionary Sailmaker. Okay, beginning with question 61, we're looking at the phrase, before entering a British-run prison during the American Revolution, prisoner of war James Forten said these words as a patriotic rejection of the British captors' offer to free him and educate him in England. So, essentially, the part we're looking at is, during the American Revolution, prisoner of war James Forten did this thing, and we want to understand where to place the commas. So, because the phrase during the American Revolution is a prepositional phrase, we want to set that aside. We always set prepositional phrases aside with commas. So we want a comma after revolution because we want to say during the American Revolution. So that rules out options A and D because there's not the comma there. If we look at options B and C, now we're understanding if we want to put a comma after Forten, as we're looking to see if there's a comma afterwards. It continues to say, prisoner of war James Forten said these words. If we look at option B, what we're saying is prisoner of war James Forten, said these words. If we look at option C, we're saying prisoner of war James Forten said these words. Because there's no break between prisoner of war James Forten said these words, we want it to just be one sentence. We're left with option C, because option B attempts to split it into two different phrases, which is not correct. Looking at question 62, we're attempting to add a sentence before he knew his chance of surviving imprisonment were slim. The options are, Forten was one of the many to serve in the American Revolution. Forten's rejection was risky. Such an offer must have been unusual, and many would later admire Forten's skills as an innovator. Now, because in the previous paragraph we're talking about his rejection of the captor's offer, and we're talking about his survival being slim, we want something that connects those two. Therefore, we go to letter G, which says that the rejection was risky because it links his rejection to the chances of surviving being slim. In letter 63, we're continuing in the same phrase, his chances of surviving. Since we're talking about one person, and we're talking about surviving, we don't say chances to surviving or chance, because that's not grammatically correct, so we can rule out B, which leaves us with chance of surviving, chances of surviving, and chance to survive. Since we're talking about one person, we wouldn't say chance because we use, if the verb ends in an S, we're usually referring to one thing. If the verb ends without an S, then we use that to describe multiple things. So since we're talking about one person, we want chances, and therefore that rules out both A and D, which leaves us with C as chances of surviving because we're talking about one person. When we go down to number 64, we're talking about the phrase, Forten also knew that if released at the war's end or as part of an exchange, he, a free black man, might be captured and sold into slavery. So what we're trying to understand is how we want to link the phrase released at war's end and being sold back into slavery. In the first option, we're given, he knew that if he was given an exchange, he, a free black man, might be sold into slavery. So we're saying that if, then, essentially, we're creating an if-then statement. If we do B, we're saying Forten knew that if released as part of an exchange, but then we end our phrase. And that is the issue with letters G, H, and J. All three break these into two separate clauses. But because we have the if here, we need a then part of the statement, as is given later. So we must stick with letter F, which allows for the if-then, because we're saying if he's released, then he might be sold back into slavery. If we look at 65, we're discussing deleting the sentence, Fortin not only survived, but he became one of the most successful businessmen and ardent abolitionists in the United States. And we're trying to understand what would happen if we deleted that sentence. So our potential options are that they describe his tactics to survive imprisonment, that they transition from a discussion of the ramification of his decision to his success as a sailmaker, they compare Fortin's work as a businessman and his role as an abolitionist, and they offer an analysis of Fortin's transition from a prisoner to a businessman and abolitionist. So if we look, we're talking about his decision to reject the option to be freed, and his prosperity if we look down at paragraph 3. So that gives us, because it's a transition from one idea to the next, that leaves us with B, which is a transition from one to the other. So for 65, we have B. 66, we're looking at Fortin's rise to the position of foreman. So we have the options: he rose to the position of foreman, he had arose to the position of foreman, he had rose to the position of foreman, and he raised to the position of foreman. Because we're talking about it actively, we don't want to say he raised to the position of foreman, and we also don't want to say that he had rose, because we're saying he currently rose, not currently, but we're talking actively. He rose to the position of foreman. So we're left with option F here. He rose, not he had arose or he had rose, but he rose. In question 67, we're looking at the phrase, employing 38 workers, white and black. So, what we're trying to understand is what essentially becomes the aside here. Do we want to say that he's employing 38 workers, white and black, comma? Do we want to say he employed 38 workers, whom were white and black, with no aside? Do we want to say he employed 38 workers, full stop, white and black? Or do we want to say he employed 38 workers, white and black? Because white and black here has a comma afterwards, it's an aside, which means that we're saying that something is white and black. We're not just saying white and black. So because we've got this comma here and it's an aside, we're describing something. And we know, logically, that we're describing the workers. And in order to show that in the best way, we put a comma before the phrase white and black and after it, which leaves us here with option A, which is the 38 workers, white and black. Fortin held his employees to a high standard. 68 is asking what happens if we lose the sentence, the bulk of Fortin's business records was probably lost after the business was sold, because we're talking about his business being sold. We're talking about his business producing many apprentices who made sales for dozens of vessels, and we're trying to discuss if we want to discuss losing his records when the business is sold. Well, this sentence is not really related to what happened before, talking about creating these apprentices, so we don't want to keep the sentence. So if we look, that gives us options H or J, which is deleting it. If we look at J, it's not a contradiction, which leaves us with H, because it changes the theme of the sentence the paragraph from talking about being an academy to talking about losing records. So that leaves us with H, where we delete the sentence to keep the paragraph more focused. Question number 69 is asking the sentence goes, soon many regarded Fortin as the city's premier sailmaker in Philadelphia. Because we already say the city, it's redundant to have the word Philadelphia, so we can look, and all of options A, B, and C say that it's the city's in Philadelphia, in native Philadelphia, in the city of Philadelphia, which is redundant, given that we already have city. So we go down to D, which is saying the premier sailmaker, and doesn't restate that it's Philadelphia, because we already know that. So D is the correct answer to 69. 70 is trying to make a nice transition between paragraphs 4 and 5. we're given a savvy businessman, Fortin supported abolitionist causes. And then the next sentence goes, when the War of 1812 closed the port of Philadelphia, Fortin used his profits in real estate and lending to support his sail-making industries. So we're going from businessmen to sail-making industries and trying to figure out what the best using his profits from sail-making. So, if we keep the original one, we're talking, the transition we're using is abolitionist causes, which is not the transition we're looking for. If we look at option G, we're transitioning from businessman to fighting for his country in the Revolutionary War to using profits. If we look at option H, we're saying he's a savvy businessman. He donated to schools and hospitals, which is close because in the next part we're talking about donations, but we aren't talking about schools and hospitals, so it's not H. And so if we got down to J, we're saying that he maintained his business during difficult times. Now, the War of 1812 is definitely a difficult time, so that part is nicely connected. And if we're talking about donating money, that means he has money during the War of 1812. So J is the best answer to question 70. Question 71, he's saying, when the need for smaller, quicker vessels changed sail design. So what we're trying to figure out is how we want to connect the adjectives smaller and quicker. In the first option, we've got a comma separating them. In the second one, we've got smaller and more quicker. But because quicker has an ER, that already means that it's more quick. So we don't need to say more quicker because we've already got the ER, which means that we can get rid of both options B and C because we don't want to say more quicker. So then all we're left with were options A and D. Now the trick here is understanding how commas work in English between adjectives. Usually when we're listing adjectives, the way to figure out if we need a comma or not is to figure out if it makes sense to put the word and in between. So what here we're saying is smaller, quicker vessels. So does it make sense to say smaller and quicker vessels? It does make sense. And because of that, we want to use the one that has the comma, which is option letter A. Question 72 is looking at, we're comparing his sailmakers, we're looking at how much money the sailmaker invested into work to abolish slavery. So in option F, we're given over greater than half. In option G, we're given over more than half of his own. In option H, we're given more than over half of his. And in J, we're given over half of his. Now, if we look at greater and more, those greater, more, and more are the same, have the same meaning as the word over. So if we say over greater, that means the same thing. We can either say greater than half or over half. Here we can say either over half or more than half, but we don't need both. In option H, we can either say more than half or over half, and as we've seen as a pattern in all three of these, over half is what we're given here in J. So over half of his fortune and work to abolish slavery is the best option. In number 73, we're given the phrase, the Revolutionary War veteran who served in this war believed the United States owed all residents the right to freedom. So what we're looking at is if we just want the Revolutionary War veteran, as we have here in option D, or do we want to say more about him? So if we say veteran who served in the war, that's redundant because a war veteran is someone who served in the war. So we know it's not A. If we look at B, we have the war veteran who cultivated the sails of freedom. Now, while that's cute, since we're talking about sails, it adds unnecessary information that doesn't really add to the passage. Again, if we look at C, we've got nurturing the road to reform, which one is implied when we're talking about him being a veteran, and 2 just adds extra information that we don't need. So, because of that, we're left with option D as the best answer. Question 74 says, the writer is considering adding to the following true statement to the essay. Writing under a pen name, Fortin himself submitted the numerous articles and letters calling for the end of slavery. We're given 4 options for where to place this. First, the first option is to place it at the beginning, where he's given the quote, and then would say that writing under a pen name, he submitted numerous articles. That doesn't make sense because we're not talking about writing under a pen name or submitting articles. We're talking about him during the Revolutionary War. Option B puts the sentence after he's talking about buying the sailmaker's business. It would say Fortin bought the sailmaker's business and wrote under pen names. Again, doesn't make sense because we're talking about the sailmaking business, not working for a newspaper. In letter H, we are looking at the possibility of putting it right after we're talking about his fortune, that he donated over half his fortune in work to abolish slavery, writing under a pen name. Again, still not quite tied. But if we look at option J, we're given the Revolutionary War, he helped finance the Liberator, a powerist abolitionist newspaper, and he wrote under a pen name calling for the end of slavery. Because that's related to calling for slavery and working on the newspaper, option J is the best. Finally, for question number 75, we're looking at the overall purpose. So the question says, suppose the writer's primary purpose had been to describe in detail the daily operations of a successful business in the newly formed United States. Would this essay accomplish that purpose? Now, the piece that really stands out in this question is the phrase daily operations, because this article is not about the actual operations of his sailmaking business so much as it is a biography of James Fortin. Because of that, we can rule out answers A and B, which say yes, which takes us to answers C and D. Now, if we look, C says no, because it focuses more on Fortin as a patriot, businessman, and abolitionist than on the daily workings of his business. That sounds pretty good. It focuses more on him as a person than on the daily workings of his business, so C is the best answer to 75. Overall, in this one, we want to look at word choice and when to look at ER words and prevent redundancies, as in 69 and 73. We're also looking at uses of commas and punctuation for clause separation.